Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our July 9th webinar on what happens when our board members don't get along or what to do when our board members don't get along. My name is Alina Gilbert. I'll be presenting this fabulous webinar today that we are all very interested in. Okay, hopefully now you can see me and the slides. So real quick, I'm going to go through these housekeeping things here super quick. First of all, thank you for joining us today. And like I said, my name is Alina Gilbert. I'll be presenting today. You should right now that everything's back to normal, hopefully the bulk of your screen is the PowerPoint. And on the left side is a little box with me, the presenter. Hello. And on the right side of your screen, there's a little chat icon, and that's where you're going to go to type in any questions you have. I will be saving questions until the end just to make sure we have enough time to get through all the materials, which I think we will, and we should have time for questions at the end. But if we don't get time for all of them, I will have my email address up on the screen, and you're always welcome to email me directly, and I will try to get you answers. This will give you one CMCA certificate. It'll be emailed to you within the next 24 to 48 hours. Very important, please. The way that this is done these days is the email and the picture of the certificate, which is in the email, are only good for 30 days. They disappear after that for some reason. So what you need to do when you get it is a couple options. One is you can print it, and that way you'll have it. Or you can right-click on the actual picture and save it as a file or as a photo or a JPEG into your computer, and that way you'll have it forever. Just do something to keep it because it's 30 days and it's gone. Poof. So as a reminder, we are recording today's presentation. We will put it up on the YouTube channel. So if you have folks that you know who wanted to see it but couldn't make it, or you want to rewatch it for some reason, it will be up on the YouTube channel in the next day or two. And finally, there is going to be a little pop-up survey at the end of the presentation where you can let us know what you think and give us any criticism or ideas or thoughts about the presentation. And I know some of you are going to write, Alina, figure out how to use your technology because this is crazy. So, and you're right. But anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and move forward. So I am guessing that everyone who is watching this webinar has experienced situations where you've had board members at odds with one another, and whether it's one board member and another board member, or whether it's factions of the board that were at odds with each other, you've been there, you've seen it, you've done it. So the purpose of this class is to talk a little bit about some concepts when it comes to how we can address conflicts and how we can resolve conflicts, and also some ideas at the very end about what if we can't really resolve it? What do we do then? So let's get started. And before we talk about the conflicts themselves, I think we need to acknowledge these four basic truths that are in front of you. The first one is you're not going to make everyone happy all of the time. And to think that there's ever going to be a situation that we are able to resolve where everyone's happy, everyone's content, and we're going to be able to do this all the time. It's just not realistic. So I think as we talk about conflicts, I think in the back of your mind, just remember, sometimes it's easier to talk about conflict resolution skills than it is to actually do it once you're out there in the real world, so to speak. Conflicts are always going to exist because people are different. They approach things from, with different blinders based on who they are, what they've been through in their life, yes, their childhood too. I mean, we're all different in how we see things. And so that creates different points of view, which is healthy. But it does lead to conflict because sometimes people aren't real good at dealing with situations where someone doesn't agree with them. There's also a lot of resources out there in conflict resolution. whether it is looking information up online with respect to different ways to handle conflict, or whether it's hiring a mediator to help you mediate a conflict. There's just a lot of resources out there, and we shouldn't forget that because those are very helpful. And finally, there are no easy answers. We try to make it easy when we talk about it, but as you know, if you've lived through this, and you have, it's not always that black and white. There's no right or wrong answer. There's just all this gray. And that's really what we're going to talk about, is how do we kind of navigate through that gray area. So the next question then is conflict always a bad thing? You know, there's people who absolutely hate conflict and will do anything and everything to stay away from it, because in their minds, if someone is angry or upset, that's not something that they can deal with. It's viewed very negatively. But if we just kind of take a step back and we look at it from purely an objective perspective, we will learn that conflict's not always bad. People can agree to disagree. A lot of times when we have conflict, we actually end up getting to a better resolution of a situation than we would otherwise. You know, what do they say? 2 minds is better than 1, 5 minds are better than 1. It may take some time, but ultimately it sure is better when you've got a whole bunch of different perspectives about a specific issue than it is when it's just one person making the decision. So you have to respect conflict in the sense that it could yield good results. It could result in some really cool ideas that we hadn't thought of before. It can add to participation. You know, so there's a lot of things that we need to understand are good things about conflict. So we shouldn't necessarily shy away from it just because the word conflict has a negative connotation to it. Okay, now the fun stuff. Why don't directors get along? I bet we could have a list that's got a million things on it if you guys all sent something in. I am focusing on kind of the big picture items today, and we'll go into specifics of each one. But why don't directors get along? Well, sometimes it's because we don't have good communication on a board. Sometimes there's power struggles. There's personality differences. People come on the board with different agendas, and there's always other things too that I'm sure you can all think of. But let's go through each of these kind of one by one and see what kind of examples there are. So, you know, poor communication. There's a whole bunch of things that could qualify as poor communication. So one is someone who doesn't communicate. That's no communication, right? Sometimes you have board members that are just quiet all the time and they don't participate and they don't communicate, and which could be a cause of conflict, because then the other board members are like, well, why aren't you talking? Why aren't you contributing here? There's also, probably more often than not, exclusionary communication. And what is that? So that is a situation where you've got less than the entire board communicating between itself, but not conveying anything to the other excluded members. This could also involve the attorney, it could involve management. So for example, I'll use myself as an example. Sometimes I get emails from one board member, and that board member will email me and say, hey, Alina, how do we remove another board member from the board? And I say, well, I am happy to respond to you, but either I'm going to copy the rest of the board on my response, or you will forward a copy of my response to the rest of the board. Which do you prefer? And do you still want me to respond? Why do I do that? Well, because this is actually a requirement under KIWA, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. And what it says is all board members must have the same information available to them at all times. So what that means is, to the extent that one board member gets information from the community manager, the attorney, whoever else, or another board member, that information needs to be distributed to the entire board, or else you are exposing yourself to liability as a board member because you're willfully breaching a requirement of the law. And not only does it apply to board members, this provision is fairly broad and it extends out to professionals who deal with associations. In fact, it specifically names attorneys who represent associations, community managers who work with associations, and CPAs. Okay, so if somebody emails me as the attorney with a question and I know they're not going to share it with anyone else, either I tell them I'm copying the rest of the board, or I'm not going to be able to respond to you because that information needs to go to everybody. And that creates some uncomfortable situations, especially if you're trying to communicate about someone on the board that you don't get along with, or that you don't like, or that you want to do something with, like remove them, right? So exclusionary communications never end well, and to boot, they're just not lawful. The other poor communication topic is nobody's actually hearing anyone. So, there's a great saying out there, I can't remember who said it, but it is that the opposite of talking isn't listening. The opposite of talking is waiting. You're waiting for the person to finish so that you can go and interject whatever it is you want to say. You already know what you're going to say, and you're just waiting for that person to stop so you can tell them what you think. And you're not really listening. You're not actively listening or hearing what they are saying. Because if you were, you wouldn't already know how you're going to respond, because you would be trying to understand what their point is, which is imperative to having a discussion, and a discussion that leads to something. And then, of course, there's the situation where information is just not getting dispersed. Why? Well, sometimes it's on purpose, right? So if one board member doesn't want the other board member to know that they're plotting to remove them, they're not going to disperse that information. A lot of times it is just an oversight. For example, you get a legal opinion and it gets emailed to the board president. Board president completely forgets it's in their inbox and forgets to send it to the other board members. And then there's an email exchange afterwards with the attorney, and attorney's like, well, didn't you read my opinion? And the board's like, what opinion? Right? And there was no ill will in that particular situation, but you can see how some directors might say, well, why you purposely didn't forward that to us because you didn't like what it said, and then it kind of escalates from there. So poor communications, I think, is one of the biggest culprits we see as to board members not getting along. But it's not the only one, right? All right, power struggle. Can you think of someone on your boards that might be having this issue? Right, I bet you can. I bet you can think of more than one person. All right, so essentially the power struggle, and some of these categories overlap. So, some of these things could also go under communication or other types of situations. So just kind of take it with a grain of salt as far as how it's organized. But our power struggle typically is exhibited by someone who argues all the time and wants to make all the decisions because they know better than everyone else. Can you think of someone like that? I can think of a few board members that I know that are like that. If basically their approach is, if you don't agree with me, you're wrong, because I know better and I'm always right and you're wrong. And it doesn't matter to me if you're a board member, or if you're the community manager who's experienced with this, or if you're the attorney. You're all wrong because you don't agree with me. I should be the one making the decisions. It's kind of like that underlying piece of it. And of course, you can see how that would breed a lot of dislike between board members. This is not a very likable person when you've got someone like that on the board. What about personality differences? We see that a lot as well. Again, this is going to kind of cross over with what we just talked about, but we're talking about the bullies, I'm going to yell and I'm going to scream until I get my way, or I'm a big person and I'm going to stand in front of you and look down at you and I'm going to intimidate you. I'm the bully. And there's the know-it-all, who again knows better than everyone else. You guys have the talk a lot person who just talks, but says absolutely nothing. Those are like my favorites because they'll monopolize the board meeting and talk, and at the end you're like, what did they just say? There was no point in that. It was just mindless chatter. So we got those folks we got to deal with. And then of course you have just the plain jerk, the person who is rude, who doesn't take into account anyone else's feeling, a person who doesn't respect others and treats them exactly that way. The jerk. Nobody likes the jerk. And any beneficial contributions that a person like that would make to the board are going to be overlooked because of the strong dislike for this person and who just they are, right? Okay. And then we have, of course, different agendas. And we know that people get on boards for various reasons. I would like to think that most of the folks who get on a board of directors is because they care about their community and they want to contribute to the well-being of the community and they want to do what's right, right? That's not always the case, of course. And we do have folks who get on the boards because they're pissed off and they don't like how prior boards have done something because they feel like they have been overlooked. My unit didn't get fixed. I'm going to get on the board and make sure my unit gets fixed. I want special privileges too, right? So it's all about me. Then there is the person who gets on the board because they think assessments are too high and they're going to do everything in their power to lower expenses. So don't spend money on that. I know someone who's going to do it cheaper. I have friends in high places. They'll do it cheap. Or the why fix it if it ain't broken. Why would we spend money to rewrite our governing documents when they've been working just fine? It doesn't matter that they violate the law. It's all good. We don't need to spend the money. So these are the people who are really focused on, let's not spend a lot of money on anything, right? And then there's people who don't want to work with anyone who is going to contradict them. I don't want a management company that's going to tell me I can't do this. I don't want a law firm that's going to tell me this is wrong. I just want to do what I want to do, and I want everyone else to say, yes, this is fine. I want all the yes men around me. So these are all the types of personalities that, you know, we see, different agendas, different personalities, different priorities is how we can look at it. And when my priorities clash with the next board member's priorities, there is going to be some sort of a conflict. Now, what kind of a conflict is going to depend, obviously, on what kind of people we are and how we choose to handle conflict, which is, yes, first you can look at this poor cat. All right, and how we handle conflict is different conflict resolution styles. So we're going to talk about 4 of them, and they're all different. Some are kind of better than others, but they all exist for various reasons, and there's various situations that might require us to use some of the less, you know, successful perhaps approaches, or some of the less happy approaches, so to speak. So the first one, though, is the collaborative way to resolve conflict. This is by far the one that is deemed the best way to resolve a conflict. Unfortunately, it's also the most difficult one. When we talk about collaborating, we talk about people working together to find creative solutions to their disagreements. And the priority is, of course, maintaining the relationship. This creates trust. It creates an optimal result where we have a win-win situation. You figure out a way for everyone to kind of get what they want, and that's how you move forward. Again, this is best case scenario, right? But you're all probably sitting there laughing going, oh yeah, right, like that's gonna happen. Well, this style of conflict resolution only works when you have parties that are willing to commit to explore options. When you've got parties that are digging their heels in and they're not willing to discuss or budge, this ain't gonna work. So again, you know your boards. If you're working with a board where people are like, well, I don't really agree with how you want to do this, but I'm willing to talk about it. Let's have a discussion about it. The more kind of reasonable board members, this is going to be a good way to go. It's not going to be a good way to go when you've got the bullies. All right. So the next option is the competing conflict resolution style. This is for the bullies. This is very authoritarian. This is basically one person who's aggressive stepping in and saying, we're doing it this way. Period. End of story. No more discussion. We're doing it this way, and too bad. So some of the kind of positives of this is it's very goal-oriented and it's very quick. Somebody's coming in, they're putting their foot down, and nobody else is saying a thing. The bad thing about it is you're going to have some resentment, you're going to have some hostility, and maybe it's not right there and then, but it's going to happen. And when would you ever use this conflict resolution style? Why even is it a conflict resolution style, you might ask? Well, here's when you would use it. You would use it when you have an emergency type of situation where you can't afford to take time to discuss things and hash them out and sing kumbaya. There is a flood in the building. There is something else, and it's pressing and it needs to get addressed ASAP. It's urgent. That's when this conflict resolution style works. If you've got someone who is willing to take the bull by the horns and willing to say, this is what we're doing, let's move forward, that will benefit that kind of a situation. Again, the other board members, even though they're following along, they may be very angry about the way that this is going. They may feel that they were not empowered to make decisions, which is all probably true. But at the same time, as I said earlier, this is when we don't have any time to empower, to discuss, and to be, have healthy debate and discussion. So this is a less than optimal conflict resolution style, but it does have its place with respect to resolution of the conflict. Avoidance. My personal name for this conflict resolution style is the kicking the can down the road style, right? It's avoiding confrontation. It's putting your head in the sand and pretending nothing is happening. This happens usually, and sometimes it goes hand in hand with an authoritative one, but this happens when someone is so scared of conflict, they would do anything to avoid it. So they're essentially going to allow themselves to be bullied, to be, talked down to, or allow the board to go in a direction they don't agree with because they don't want the conflict. But what does this do? This person is going to have resentment. There is just no way in God's green earth that you are going to let someone walk over you and then not have any resentment towards them. And the longer it goes unaddressed, the worse it gets. It's like, it's like a stone rolling down the hill. They say a rolling stone gathers no moss, but if there's a whole bunch of snow, it's going to turn into a bigger and bigger and bigger snowball, And that's what's going to happen. And so ultimately, at some point, something's going to happen. That's why it's kicking the can down the road. You've got unaddressed problems. You've got unresolved issues, at least for this individual who is avoiding it. And it's going to build up. And at some point, either they're going to explode and it's going to be a big, huge confrontation, or maybe they quit the board and then they become that owner that criticizes everything the board does, right? You know, those people. That's how it happens. That's how it happens. So that is not an optimal way to resolve conflict, but unfortunately, this is something that happens when our board members are too scared of conflict and are willing to put themselves out there. So the last one is compromising. And this one is probably the second best one. It is where both parties, they talk and they find a middle ground. So basically everyone agrees to give something up so that they can be somewhere in the middle. This is a good way to resolve conflict. Again, people who are willing to sit down and talk. But it's also a resolution style when neither party is super aggressive. If you've got a party that's super aggressive, this also is not going to work much like the first one we talked about. So again, the good thing about this resolution style is you get to some middle ground. Everyone kind of has equal power, right? And it's good if you've got some sort of complex situation you need to weed through. But what's not good is nobody gets what they want, right? Everybody's got to compromise something. And in the end, nobody is fully satisfied. So again, could this be a way of kicking the can down the road? Perhaps, perhaps not. So, but this is the fourth conflict resolution style. Okay. Or there's rock, paper, scissors. You can do that. Sometimes that works better. All right. So let's talk about conflict resolution steps here. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time. If you're looking at your handout that was emailed this morning, there's a couple of these check mark things moved around. So you may not have it exactly the same as what we have on the screen in front of you, but it's just moved within categories, so it's all still applicable. All right, so brainstorming solutions. I really love this meme. I have to say, for any of you, Star Wars fans out there, hopefully you're getting a good laugh out of it. But anyway, so the first step really is to try to brainstorm solutions. And we all inherently know what brainstorming is, right? It's setting a time and a place, getting people together, and kind of before you start brainstorming, what you want to figure out is, do the parties have any common ground? Do we have basic values that are important to both sides? And I will tell you time and time again, the basic value and what the parties have in common is this is their biggest investment. This is their home. And they want it to pay off. They want to see the property values going up, right? They want to see the community getting better and looking pretty because that impacts their property values. When push comes to shove, we are going to err on the side of let's make more money for my investment. And most of the time, that's where you find the common ground between your two sides. Now, kind of taking a step from that is if we can agree that this is what we want, now we need to figure out how we do that where both sides see at least a possibility of their property values going up, of the community becoming a higher quality community. How do we do that? So, and that's where we differ, is how do we do that? And so we're going to need to dig a little bit to see, kind of why people differ. But most likely, like I said earlier, it's because they come from different backgrounds and they have different ways of looking at things. They have different experiences they're drawing from. And so they have different perspectives, and that's okay. So ultimately, what do we want to get to? We want to get to creating the list of possible solutions, right? Okay, so let's talk about communication. And this is our communication during our brainstorming sessions as well. So it is very important when you are communicating during these sessions that people stay calm and keep clear, and that it is very clear that there are no bad suggestions here. I know we always say that, right? And then somebody's going to say, oh, let's do X. And people are like, right? But it is very important when you are going through a brainstorming session that every suggestion is put on the board. They're not criticized. They're not going to be poo-pooed at, because we need to have a huge list, and then only then can we start wading through them. So creating that list is the first hurdle. And the only way you can do that is if people are respectable to one another and every suggestion goes on the board. All right. We're going to define what our problem is. That's part of the discussion of, like, why aren't we agreeing? And we're going to talk about what each party brings to the table. Again, no interruptions, right? We're going to be very respectful. Again, this is the part that I always say is easier said than done, right? How many times do we come into a meeting, a group meeting, and we say, everyone's going to be respectful. We're going to, nobody's going to interrupt. Nobody's going to yell. And what happens? Everyone interrupts. Everyone yells. And so, again, this is far easier said than done. But we're also going to talk about past attempts to resolve the situation, if there have been any. Why do we want to do that? We're not doing it to say you screwed up, even though it's so easy to do that. We're doing it because we want to see what didn't work for us and why, so we don't repeat the same mistakes again. This is not for blaming someone for saying it didn't work, because you were too lazy to do your thing. No, that's not what we're going to say. We're going to say it didn't work because we weren't holding each other accountable for what we were supposed to be doing. Maybe that's how you phrase it. We're not going to blame any particular person. We're going to blame the situation and what went wrong. Okay. So as we are holding this session, we're going to discuss the possible solutions. We got a whole bunch of them now on the board, right? We've brainstormed. We've got a whole bunch of things written down. Well, now we need to discuss them. And again, this is not a quick thing to do. We're going to discuss them. We are going to narrow it down to one thing. We're going to narrow it down to one thing, and that's so difficult to do. So I'm not trying to minimize the difficulty, but we're just talking about conceptually what we are trying to get to here. Once we whittle it down to one thing, you can't stop there. Because I can tell you from experience, if you stop there, nothing's going to happen. Everyone's going to go their separate ways and nothing's going to change. What you have to do is go past that. Now you've got to assign roles and duties to each side. This is how we're going to try and resolve it. Side A, you're going to be responsible for doing X, Y, and Z. Side B, you're going to be responsible for whatever. So you're going to figure out everyone's role, okay? And then you're also going to set another meeting to discuss what we've done and how much we've progressed. Because if you don't do that, there's no accountability. So it's very important to hold everyone accountable to what they have agreed to do. And if they haven't done it, by the time we have the next meeting, they need to be told that you have not done what you agreed to do, and this is why we can't move forward, right? You need to commit to this, and you need to do this. And nobody wants to hear that. They just don't. But how do we get people to commit, and how do we get them to be accountable? Well, maybe we have some sort of a reward system for contributions, right? What kind of rewards? Positive reinforcement. Maybe we say, hey, if we can successfully resolve this issue, both sides get a $50 Starbucks card. I don't know. I mean, it could be something as stupid as that, but it is something where at the end of the day, we are working towards resolution and towards a reward that we have earned because we've worked really hard at this. So it is really, really important to go through all these steps when we are trying to resolve conflict. Again, not always going to happen. We are going to have difficult people who just don't want to cooperate, who don't want to come to the table, who don't want to meet. So what does that mean for all these steps? Well, it might mean we need to look at some other options, which we're about to do. Okay. Let's talk about some other options. When conflict resolution in its true form fails, what can we do? All right, so we can edit board director qualifications in the bylaws through an amendment. Why would we do that? Well, sometimes the problem is conflict arises because someone doesn't attend meetings, or they don't participate, or they're delinquent in their assessments. If we don't have anything in the bylaws that says, you know, you will be removed or you won't be on the board if you don't meet these basic qualifications, then that is really a means to an end. We have realized that we can't have people on the board who don't participate. Therefore, we're going to add a qualification that says in order, to be eligible for the board, you must attend, or you must not miss more than X number of meetings in any given, fiscal year or something like that. You can be creative with it. Or you must be current in the payment of your assessments. Or you cannot have any kind of an adversarial action against the association or the board. There's different ways of doing it. So depending on what the problem is. If you are going to go through an amendment to your bylaws to add qualifications to directors, if you are a community created after July 1, 1992, you have to get homeowner approval to make this modification, even if your bylaws say the board can approve changes. This is something that Kai was going to require of you. If you are pre-July 1, 1992, then that Kiowa provision will not apply. So hypothetically, you could update the director qualifications with just a board vote, because the Nonprofit Act says that the board has authority to amend the bylaws unless it's prohibited by the law, or unless there is specific language in your bylaws that prohibit it. So if you have language in your bylaws that says these bylaws may be amended by a vote of the majority of quorum of homeowners, does that prohibit having the board amend the bylaws? It does not. If it had said you may only amend the bylaws with a homeowner vote, then it would prohibit it. But it doesn't say that. It says you may amend with homeowners. That's not exclusionary. So that means the statutory provision in the Nonprofit Act that allows the board to amend the bylaws is going to stand, and you will be able to do that. So again, it's going to be a difference between pre and post Kiowa communities. My personal take, here it is, Alina's personal take is when you're changing director qualifications, I personally think it is better to get homeowner approval because it's just such a big deal, because you're talking about who can and cannot serve on a board. And we don't really want the board to make that, unilaterally. I don't think it's a great idea. But anyhow, next is director education. Sometimes the conflict is because neither party understands what their duties are, what the law says, what protocol is, what their documents require, right? It's ignorance, and Lord knows we see a lot of that. So sometimes it's a matter of telling your board, hey, CAI, Altitude, whoever is doing a webinar, is doing a class on board responsibilities, on covenant enforcement, on collections, whatever, you should go to this because it'll help you understand the process. So sometimes that could be a way to quote unquote enlighten your board members so that they better understand certain situations so that they're not expecting something that's not reasonable. Sometimes you have the attorney attend a board meeting. I have attended many a board meeting where there was a lot of conflict between boards. And when I go, the first thing I do is I talk about board duties. You have board duties. You have certain ethical requirements. You have certain fiduciary obligations. And here's what happens if you don't comply with these. You are exposed to personal liability as a board member. You may not have insurance coverage if you get sued because you intentionally violated your fiduciary duty. I think the fear tactic, although unfortunate, but it works. It works so well. Nobody wants to hear that they're going to have personal liability exposure. Nobody wants to hear that you may have money coming out of your personal pocket because you will not be defended by insurance if you get sued over this. So I think that's something that an attorney can talk to the board about, and an attorney can be at the meeting to also discuss, okay, what is the conflict? What are you disagreeing about? If it's a legal issue, obviously the attorney can say, well, here's what the law says, and here's how it needs to be handled, right? Of course, you're always going to have board members that are going to say, you don't know what you're talking about, attorney. I know better, right? We have those. They know better than everyone. But ultimately, you're paying the attorney to provide you with their expert opinion, and you should take it. All right. Strong directors follow agenda. So this is, although the board president technically has the duty to conduct meetings, it's not always the best person to conduct meetings. If you have a board president who is not assertive, who cannot control the table, so to speak, that may not be the best person to conduct a meeting. The best person to conduct a meeting, of course, is a parliamentarian. You don't typically have parliamentarians at your meetings, but you should look at the personalities around the room. And sometimes it's the secretary, it's the VP, it's the treasurer, it's a member at large. It's who can command an audience, who can follow the agenda, and who can ensure that people are staying in line with what their role is. Who can control the homeowners and cut them off when they need to? Who's going to keep the meeting moving? May not be the board president. A lot of times they make the managers do it, right? How many times have you managers who are listening, how many times have you had to conduct a meeting because the board was like, we don't want to do it? And so tag, you're it, you're going to be conducting the meeting. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes it doesn't work. So again, it's really important to look at the people at the table and look at their personalities and try to find the one who is going to do the best job at controlling the audience. Okay. Conduct of meetings policy. This kind of goes hand in hand with following the agenda. Everyone has a conduct of meetings policy. It's one of the 9 required policies. How many of you have recently looked at it? How many of you have looked at it in the last month? How many of you have looked at it before your last meeting? I'm guessing most people just kind of tuck it away and they forget they have it. But it's such a good tool to have because it gives you a process. First of all, it tells you what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not acceptable. It then tells you, here's what's going to happen for those people who do not exhibit appropriate behavior. And all you got to do is follow the policy. So if you have a strong director or individual running your meeting, they will follow that policy. So you disrupt the meeting, you get a warning. You do it again, we kick you out. Okay? I mean, it is, or if you refuse to leave, we're going to adjourn the meeting. We're going to call it another time. So there are options, and your conduct of meetings policy is an amazing tool for you guys to use when you have difficult meetings, because either the board isn't getting along, people are screaming at each other. We can ask board members to leave a meeting if they are not acting appropriately. We absolutely can. But you have to read your policy, you have to know what it says, and if you feel like it's not really harsh enough, talk to your legal counsel about maybe tightening it up a little bit. Read your policy and see if you're comfortable with it, and then do it. Oh, I just saw somebody, sorry, I don't usually do the comments, but I just saw somebody wrote mute them on Zoom. Yes, if you are doing an electronic meeting with your board or whatnot, if you've got people who are disruptive, if you've got board members who are being aggressive, mute them. Absolutely mute them. I go to a lot of these kinds of meetings that are virtual, and nobody seems to mute anyone. It's just people who want to talk, keep talking, keep yelling. No one gets muted. And again, this also goes to who is running your meeting, who's the host of the Zoom, because you want to make sure they have the gumption to be able to keep things under control, even if they're not running the meeting itself. But the people who are doing the Zoom, whether it's the board president or the community manager, don't be afraid to mute people. Absolutely, that was a great point. And finally, director removal. How do you remove a director? Well, there's a quick summary. One is, for the most part, the board cannot remove a board member. The only time that could work is when the board member was appointed by the board, right? So if the board appoints the board member, the board can remove that board member. Anyone who's elected by the membership can only be removed by the membership. So what does that mean? It means there's going to have to be a meeting, a special meeting of owners, usually for the purpose of voting on the removal of one or more or all directors on the board. We're seeing more and more of this as time goes on. Because there's more and more conflict, it seems. And when board members don't get along, the community sees it and they don't like it. They don't trust a board that can't get along, and they want to see some new blood there. So you can have at least 20% of your homeowners submit something saying we want a special meeting to remove the board or a board member. The board can call the meeting, the board president can call it, or two directors can call it. So there's different ways of calling the meeting, but essentially that's what would happen. And for a post-Kiowa community, so post-July 1, 1992, Kiowa says you need 2/3 of the owners who are present at the meeting to vote in favor of the removal for someone to be removed. Now remember, it's 2/3 of those who are present, not 2/3 of all. And at a minimum, we still need quorum. If you have a pre-Kiowa community, so pre-July 1, 1992, then it's whatever your documents say. Okay, then you got to follow what the requirement is in your documents for director removal. So sometimes, unfortunately, there is just no other way to do it. And finally, mediation. If both parties are willing to go to mediation, I personally think that could be a good way to go, but only if you've got reasonable folks. If you don't, chances are mediation's not going to solve anything because nobody's going to be willing to come to the table. So those are some other options to consider when you just can't resolve the conflict. Yes, mediation. If you have the bear mediate, easy solution. So, okay, we have 8 minutes for questions, and let's hope that is enough. So I'm just going to scroll from the bottom up. A whole bunch of these are, hey, I can see you, I can't see the slides from the beginning. Let's see, so let me get to the actual question. Oh, it's not a question. Here we go. How is exclusionary communication with legal enforced? Well, the attorney kind of should be running that show where if you have a board member who is trying to reach out just to the attorney should be having that discussion with them and basically saying, hey, you're going to need to make sure the rest of the board sees this, or you give them a copy of it, or I can respond and copy the rest of the board, but they need to get at least the commitment from the board member that they're going to give that information to the rest of the board. Now, I know, I'm not stupid. I know some board members will say, yeah, I'll do it, and then they never do it. But that kind of is on that board member. As the attorney, my job is to have them tell me that they're going to do it. And then that's kind of where my duty would end at that point. All right. Should equal responsibility go along with equal power? How do you deal with a board member who wants to see every single communication? Board member with law firm, with management company, ad hoc committees with community members, communication between board members, and is known to share board communications, including confidential ones with community members, but rarely offers feedback or anything important to the board is working on, and contributes very little to the board goals. See, now there's a conflict right there, and that falls under a whole bunch of different things that we talked about, the reasons why board members don't get along. So let me start off by saying one, and I know some of you are not going to like this, but when you have someone who is on the board, they are a board member, doesn't matter if you like them, it doesn't matter if they're nice, they are entitled to see every single document of the association. The board is the body that governs the corporation, and each board member has unfettered access to all corporate documents. And management cannot tell a board member, no, you can't see this. Other board members can't tell the board member, no, you can't see this. They have an unfettered right to all corporate documents, which would include communication with legal counsel, communication with management, anything sent out to the homeowners. I mean, anything that we have, they would be able to see. Now, the second point is, but they're going to give it to other homeowners, and they shouldn't be doing that. And that is true. And that breaches their duty of confidentiality. So what do we do in that case? That might be a really good opportunity to have the attorney come and provide some education for that board member, or to have that board member attend a board member basics class, for example, that we put on in the evening. So, you know, they need to be educated. And if they're not willing to get the education on their own, you may need to force them to be educated by having their legal counsel show up to a board meeting and have that discussion with them. Conduct for ratification meeting, open-ended to delay. I apologize. I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mind resubmitting like with a little more detail? I apologize. Clearly my coffee is not working well. Okay. What if a board member does not accept the majority decision and disparages the board to the rest of the community after the meeting. Again, this is just like that board member who goes and discusses board business with people outside of a meeting that they're not entitled to do. So it's exactly the same thing. I would say that board member perhaps needs a little bit of understanding as to what their liability exposure is. That could mean that they have the attorney come to a meeting and talk about it. It could mean that they have asked for a legal opinion from the attorney, a written opinion as to what happens when board members do that. The attorney prepares it, then this person is given a copy of that opinion. They need to understand that they're exposing themselves to personal liability and that they may not have insurance coverage for it, and they may be paying out of their own pockets to defend themselves in court. Okay. Let's see, can a board member who was appointed by the board to fill a vacancy be removed by the board? Yep, we did mention that. Let's see. Can a board member be prohibited from contacting board counsel except when authorized by the board? Yes, they can. As long as you have, the board has discretion to determine who the contacts are with their various contractors, with their experts, you know, so they can decide that the board president is going to be the point of contact and nobody else can contact the attorney. From the attorney's perspective, what I would want to see before I stop communicating with a board member is I need an email where the whole board is copied on it. So I know everyone has knowledge of that email that says, Alina, you can only communicate with this board member, or Alina, you can't communicate with this director any longer. So as long as I have that, I'm going to mark my file and I'm not going to communicate with that person. Is that all information discussed with the attorney, either verbal or written, must be shared with all board members? Yes, all. Absolutely all. What if a board president refuses to solicit, this will be the last question, refuses to solicit input from board members? She is the president and she knows best. Well, again, I'm going back to they need to be educated. That's not how the board works. The board works by majority rule. And if she has not been delegated that authority, all she is doing is acting outside the scope of her authority and exposing herself to liability. Time to educate the board president. Again, if she is not willing to have an attorney attend a meeting, then perhaps you can get a written opinion from the association's legal counsel as to what that means and what that exposes her to. Okay, we are done. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining. Again, if you have time, please, please, please respond to the questionnaire you get as soon as I end the webinar. But thank you. We will see you all next time. Have a great day.